The red light on the National Court Network camera blinked on as 12 million Americans tuned in live. "This landmark police brutality case begins now," announced anchor Rebecca Hayes. Inside Chicago District Court, Judge Michael Washington was about to preside over the most watched trial of the decade, the death of Robert Washington, his own father. Officer Karen Rodriguez blocked the distinguished black man in the marble hallway. "Sir, this is a restricted area during live broadcast," she barked, her hand moving to her baton. Michael adjusted his professional tie calmly. "Officer, I have every right to be here." Her partner Lisa Thompson stepped closer, sneering. "Sir, I don't care what you think your rights are. You're disrupting a federal proceeding." He looked directly into the camera lens visible through the courtroom doors. "Then perhaps you should check who's presiding over that proceeding." Without warning, Rodriguez grabbed his shoulders and slammed him against the heavy oak courtroom door. The impact cracked through the live audio feed as 12 million viewers watched in horror. Michael crashed to the cold marble floor, his head striking the brass nameplate with a sickening thud that echoed through millions of television speakers. Blood immediately began pooling beneath his dark hair. As he lay motionless on the courthouse floor, his blood staining the marble that 12 million people could see through the broadcast, Michael slowly reached for his fallen briefcase. What he pulled out next would not only shock the nation watching live, it would expose how these two officers had crossed every line of justice. Because the man bleeding on that floor wasn't just any victim. He was the judge who would decide the fate of these officers and prove that justice applies to everyone. If you believe that no one should ever face police brutality while seeking justice, type accountability below. Then comment your country and city. Let's see where people stand against judicial intimidation worldwide. Your participation shows that courtroom dignity transcends borders. The aftermath of the assault sent shockwaves through the courthouse and across the nation. Bailiff James Brown rushed through the courtroom doors to find Judge Michael Washington lying in a pool of blood, while officers Rodriguez and Thompson stood over him with the casual indifference of women who believed they were above accountability. "What the hell happened here?" Brown demanded, his hand moving instinctively to his radio to call for medical assistance and FBI backup. Rodriguez, still breathing heavily from the assault, replied in the monotone voice she had used countless times before. Suspect was interfering with court proceedings and became combative. He fell during the arrest. But their carefully rehearsed lies were worthless. Every second of the assault had been captured by the courthouse's sophisticated audio system and transmitted live to 12 million Americans. There would be no covering up this brutality, no hiding behind false reports and police union protection. In living rooms across America, viewers were already flooding social media with outrage. The hashtag #JusticeForJudge began trending within minutes, though most people still didn't know the true identity of the man bleeding on the courthouse floor. Inside the courtroom, Attorney David Johnson heard the commotion and rushed toward the entrance. When he saw Michael Washington on the floor, his legal mind immediately recognized the magnitude of what had occurred. This wasn't just an assault. It was a federal crime committed on live television in front of millions of witnesses. The National Court Network's technical crew struggled to maintain their broadcast as the story shifted from a routine trial coverage to breaking news of unprecedented proportions. Director Michael Chen shouted instructions to his camera operators. "Keep rolling. This is the biggest story of the decade." Meanwhile, FBI agents who had been monitoring the trial due to its national significance were already mobilizing. Agent Maria Rodriguez received the emergency call while reviewing case files in her downtown Chicago office. "We have an assault on a federal judge in progress," came the urgent voice through her radio. "All units respond immediately." Michael Washington stirred on the marble floor, consciousness slowly returning as the metallic taste of blood filled his mouth. The right side of his head throbbed with each heartbeat, and he could feel the warmth of blood trickling down his cheek. But his mind was crystal clear about what needed to happen next. He had come to this courthouse to seek justice for his father's death at the hands of police officers who thought they were above the law. Instead, he had become another victim of the same type of violence that had destroyed his family 3 years ago. But unlike his father, he had survived. And unlike his father's case, this assault had been witnessed by 12 million Americans in real time. The irony was devastating and perfect. These officers had just provided the nation with a live demonstration of exactly the type of police brutality that the trial was meant to address. They had proven, beyond any possible doubt, that the problem wasn't isolated incidents or bad apples. It was a systemic culture that saw certain people as less deserving of respect and protection. "My briefcase," Michael whispered, his voice barely audible. "Where is my briefcase?" Bailiff Brown looked around and spotted the leather briefcase that had been knocked from his hands during the assault. It lay several feet away, its contents partially spilled onto the marble floor. "It's right here, sir, but you need to stay still until the paramedics arrive." Michael tried to sit up, wincing from the pain shooting through his skull. "Please," he said with growing urgency. "I need my briefcase." Rodriguez scoffed from her position near the courtroom doors. "Sir, you need medical attention, not your paperwork. You should be thanking us for not charging you with resisting arrest." The callousness of her words sent a ripple of anger through the assembled court personnel. Even other police officers present began to distance themselves from Rodriguez and Thompson, recognizing that their actions had gone far beyond acceptable use of force. Brown retrieved the briefcase and knelt beside Michael. "What do you need from it?" With shaking hands, Michael reached into the briefcase and withdrew a folded black garment. The sight of it caused immediate confusion among the onlookers. It was clearly some kind of official clothing, but its significance wasn't immediately apparent. "Help me stand," Michael requested, his voice growing stronger despite his injuries. "Sir, I really think you should wait for medical—" "Help me stand," he repeated with unmistakable authority. Brown and Attorney Johnson carefully assisted Michael to his feet. He swayed slightly from the head injury, but managed to maintain his balance. Blood still streamed from his forehead, but his eyes were clear and focused with fierce determination. With deliberate ceremonial movements, Michael unfolded the black garment and draped it over his shoulders. The gasps from the crowd were audible even through the live broadcast audio. It was a judicial robe. The recognition spread through the assembled group like wildfire. Court clerks covered their mouths in shock. Security guards stepped back in stunned disbelief. Attorney Johnson stared with growing understanding and horror. "Oh my God," someone whispered. "He's a judge." Officer Rodriguez's face went pale as the implications hit her like a physical blow. Officer Thompson began backing away, as if distance could somehow undo what they had just done. Michael Washington, blood still flowing from his wound, straightened his shoulders and looked directly at the two officers who had assaulted him. When he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of judicial authority. "I am Judge Michael Washington," he announced clearly, ensuring that every word would be captured by the live broadcast. "I am the presiding judge for this courthouse, and I was scheduled to begin the most important trial of my career in this very courtroom." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the background noise of the courthouse seemed to cease, as the magnitude of what had occurred became clear to everyone present. Rodriguez's legs felt weak. She had just assaulted a sitting federal judge on live television, in front of 12 million viewers. Her career wasn't just over. Her life as she knew it was finished. "Furthermore," Michael continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "the trial I was about to begin involves the death of Robert Washington, my father, who was killed by police officers 3 years ago." The revelation hit the courthouse like a thunderbolt. The man they had brutalized wasn't just any judge. He was the son of the very victim whose case was about to be tried. What happened next would redefine American justice forever. The courthouse fell into a silence so profound that the only sound was the steady drip of blood from Judge Michael Washington's forehead onto the marble floor. 12 million Americans stared at their television screens in stunned disbelief, trying to process what they had just witnessed and heard. Judge Michael Washington, still wearing his blood-stained shirt beneath the judicial robe, looked directly into the camera lens that was broadcasting this moment to the nation. His next words would be quoted in legal textbooks, civil rights seminars, and congressional hearings for decades to come. 3 years ago, my father, retired Police Sergeant Robert Washington, was killed during what the officers involved claimed was a routine traffic stop, he began, his voice steady despite the throbbing pain in his head. Those officers said he resisted arrest. They said he was combative. They said they had no choice but to use deadly force. Officer Rodriguez leaned against the courthouse wall, her face ashen, as the full scope of her catastrophic mistake became clear. She had not only assaulted a federal judge on live television, she had assaulted the son of the victim in the very case he was about to preside over. The officers who killed my father filed reports claiming he attacked them, Michael continued, blood still trickling down his cheek as he spoke. They said he reached for their weapons. They painted him as a dangerous criminal who brought about his own death through his actions. Officer Thompson frantically whispered to her partner, "We need to call our union rep. We need to call her right now." But it was far too late for union representatives or damage control. Every second of their assault had been captured in high definition and broadcast to a national audience. There would be no explaining away this level of brutality against a sitting judge. Michael Washington took a step forward, and the crowd of court personnel instinctively parted before him. Even injured and bleeding, he commanded absolute authority in his courthouse. "What you have just witnessed," he said, addressing both the people present and the millions watching at home, "is exactly what happened to my father. Two police officers decided that a black person didn't belong where they were, escalated a peaceful encounter into violence, and then justified their actions by claiming the victim was at fault." In the National Court Network studio, anchor Rebecca Hayes could barely speak. "Ladies and gentlemen," she managed to say, "we are witnessing what may be the most significant moment in modern American judicial history." Across the country, phones were ringing in every newsroom, every civil rights organization, and every law enforcement agency. The hashtag #TheCharmed Judge Washington was trending worldwide within minutes. Videos of the assault were being shared millions of times across social media platforms. Attorney David Johnson stepped forward, his legal mind working rapidly to understand the implications of what had just occurred. "Your Honor," he said formally, acknowledging Michael's judicial status, "we need to get you medical attention immediately." Michael raised his hand to stop the attorney's approach. "The medical attention can wait," he said firmly, "but justice cannot." He turned to face Officers Rodriguez and Thompson directly, his bloodied face serving as a living testament to their brutality. "Officers, you have just committed assault and battery against a federal judge, while that assault was being broadcast live to the American people. But more than that, you have provided this nation with a perfect demonstration of how police violence begins, with the assumption that certain people don't belong in certain places." Rodriguez tried to speak, her voice cracking with desperation. "Your Honor, we didn't know, we had no idea you were—" "Exactly," Michael interrupted, his judicial authority cutting through her excuses like a blade. "You didn't know who I was, so you felt entitled to assault me. The question this nation must now ask is, would your behavior have been acceptable if I had been anyone else? Would brutality be justified if I had been a court clerk or a witness, or simply a citizen trying to observe justice in action?" The question hung in the air like a challenge to everything wrong with American policing. In living rooms across the country, viewers found themselves confronting uncomfortable truths about how quickly peaceful encounters could turn violent when certain assumptions were made about certain people. Bailiff James Brown approached cautiously, still concerned about Michael's head injury. "Your Honor, the paramedics have arrived. Please let them examine you." Michael nodded but remained standing, addressing the cameras one final time before receiving medical treatment. "The trial that was supposed to begin today will still proceed," he announced. "I will still preside over the case involving my father's death, because justice delayed is justice denied. But now this trial will serve a dual purpose. It will not only seek accountability for my father's death, but it will also demonstrate to the American people what justice looks like when it is applied equally to everyone." He paused, looking directly at Rodriguez and Thompson, including police officers who believe they are above the law. As paramedics carefully cleaned and bandaged Judge Michael Washington's head wound, the entire nation was erupting in response to what they had witnessed. Phone lines at news stations were overwhelmed. Social media platforms were struggling to handle the unprecedented volume of posts, shares, and comments flooding their servers. In the National Court Network studio, anchor Rebecca Hayes was joined by legal analyst Dr. Patricia Henderson, a former federal prosecutor who specialized in police misconduct cases. Dr. Henderson, Rebecca said, her voice still shaking from what they had broadcast, "In your 30 years of legal experience, have you ever seen anything like what we just witnessed?" Dr. Henderson removed her glasses, still processing the magnitude of the moment. "Rebecca, what we just saw represents a convergence of every issue plaguing American justice: police brutality, racial profiling, and the assumption that authority figures are above accountability. But it also represents something unprecedented: a sitting federal judge becoming a victim of the very type of violence he was about to adjudicate." Meanwhile, in the courthouse, Michael Washington sat on a bench as paramedics finished treating his injury. The gash on his forehead required 7 stitches, but he had refused to be transported to a hospital. He had a trial to conduct, and nothing, not even his own assault, would prevent justice from moving forward. Officer Rodriguez stood in handcuffs, her earlier confidence completely shattered. The reality of her situation was sinking in. She had assaulted a federal judge on live television while that judge was on his way to preside over a police brutality case. Her career was over, her pension was forfeit, and she would likely spend years in federal prison. Officer Thompson faced the same fate. Both women were being read their rights by FBI agents who had arrived within minutes of the assault. The Bureau had been monitoring the trial due to its national significance, and they were prepared to act immediately when federal crimes were committed. Officer Rodriguez, Agent Maria Rodriguez, said as she completed the Miranda warning, "You are under arrest for assault and battery against a federal judge, violation of civil rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice. Officer Thompson, you face the same charges." The irony was inescapable. These officers, who had arrived at the courthouse to provide security for a police brutality trial, were now defendants in their own police brutality case. Attorney David Johnson approached Judge Washington carefully. "Your Honor, with respect, I believe the court should consider postponing today's proceedings given what has occurred." Michael looked up from the paramedic's work, his eyes clear and determined, despite the fresh bandage on his forehead. "Counselor, justice has been delayed for 3 years since my father's death. It will not be delayed any longer." He stood up, testing his balance and finding it satisfactory. "This trial will proceed as scheduled. In fact, given what has just occurred, it is more important than ever that this trial proceed immediately." Michael Washington's mind traveled back to that terrible night 3 years ago when he received the phone call that would change his life forever. His father, Robert Washington, had been a 25-year veteran of the Chicago Police Department, a man who had dedicated his life to serving and protecting his community with honor and distinction. Robert Washington had never received a single complaint for excessive force during his entire career. He had been a mentor to young officers, teaching them that the badge was a symbol of service, not superiority. He had coached Little League baseball, volunteered at homeless shelters, and served as a deacon at his church. On the night of March 15, 2021, Robert Washington was driving home from his grandson's birthday party when he was pulled over by officers Sandra Murphy and Jennifer Wilson. The official report stated that he had been stopped for a broken tail light, though the car's maintenance records showed all lights were functioning properly. What followed was a textbook example of how police encounters could escalate from routine to deadly when officers made assumptions based on racial bias rather than actual behavior. Despite Robert's calm compliance and his attempts to identify himself as a retired officer, Murphy and Wilson treated him as a dangerous criminal from the moment they approached his vehicle. The body camera footage, which had been hidden from the family for 2 years, showed Robert Washington sitting peacefully in his car, hands visible on the steering wheel, speaking respectfully to the officers. When asked to show identification, he had clearly announced his movements and slowly reached for his wallet. But officers Murphy and Wilson had already decided he was a threat. When Robert reached for his retired police identification, Wilson claimed she saw him lunging for a weapon. She fired 3 shots into his back as he stood with his hands raised outside his vehicle. Robert Washington died in the same parking lot where he had once brought his grandchildren to feed ducks at a nearby pond. The last words captured on the body camera audio were his desperate pleas. "Please don't shoot me. I'm a retired police officer. I have grandchildren." The officers' initial reports painted Robert as aggressive and non-compliant. They claimed he had resisted arrest and posed an imminent threat to their safety. The internal investigation ruled the shooting justified based on their false testimonies. It took 3 years of legal battles, federal intervention, and the discovery of the hidden body camera footage for the truth to emerge. Judge Michael Washington adjusted his freshly donned judicial robe, the bandage on his forehead visible to everyone in the packed courtroom and to the millions still watching the live broadcast. The weight of history pressed down on the proceedings as he prepared to deliver his opening remarks. "Before we begin," Judge Washington announced, his voice carrying absolute authority despite the trauma he had just endured, "I want to address what has occurred this morning. I have been the victim of an assault by 2 police officers in the hallway of this courthouse. That assault was witnessed by millions of Americans through live television." He paused, scanning the faces in the courtroom. Defendants, attorneys, spectators, and media representatives who were documenting every word. "Some might suggest that I should recuse myself from this case due to what has happened, but I will not. The assault I suffered 30 minutes ago demonstrates exactly why this trial is necessary, and why justice cannot be delayed or deterred by intimidation, whether that intimidation is intentional or not." Defense attorney Michael Richardson shifted uncomfortably at his table. His strategy for defending the officers who killed Robert Washington had been built on the assumption that this would be a routine trial with limited public attention. Now, with 12 million Americans watching and his client's colleagues having just committed an identical crime on live television, his entire approach was in ruins. "The case before us today," Judge Washington continued, "involves the death of Robert Washington, a retired police sergeant who was killed during what officers claimed was a traffic stop gone wrong. The deceased was my father, a fact that is now public knowledge. However, my personal connection to this case will not prevent me from ensuring that justice is served fairly and completely." He looked directly at the defense table, where officers Sandra Murphy and Jennifer Wilson sat in obvious discomfort. The defendants in this case have the right to a fair trial, regardless of what their colleagues have done today. They will receive that fair trial, but they will also face the full weight of justice if the evidence proves their guilt. Attorney David Johnson rose to present his opening statement for the prosecution. He had been preparing for this moment for 3 years, but the events of the morning had given his case a power and urgency he had never anticipated. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Johnson began, 3 years ago, Robert Washington was driving home from his grandson's birthday party when he was pulled over for what officers claimed was a broken tail light. Robert Washington was a 25-year veteran of law enforcement who had never received a single complaint for excessive force during his entire career. He gestured toward a large monitor where body camera footage was prepared for display. "What you are about to see will show you exactly how a routine traffic stop became a killing, and how the same mentality that we witnessed in this courthouse 30 minutes ago led to the death of an innocent man." The courtroom was silent as Attorney Johnson prepared to show the jury the body camera footage that would expose the truth about Robert Washington's death. He gestured toward the large monitor where the evidence was prepared for display. The monitor flickered to life, displaying the timestamp, March 15, 2021, 8:47 p.m. The body camera belonged to Officer Sandra Murphy, one of the defendants now sitting at the defense table. The footage showed a quiet residential street illuminated by streetlights and the police cruiser's headlights. Robert Washington's silver sedan was pulled over near a park where children often played during the day. The 68-year-old retired sergeant sat calmly in his driver's seat, his hands visible on the steering wheel, exactly as police training teaches civilians to position themselves during traffic stops. "Good evening, sir," came Officer Murphy's voice through the camera's audio. "Do you know why I pulled you over tonight?" Robert Washington's voice was clear and respectful. "No, officer, I don't. I was driving the speed limit and following all traffic laws." "Your left taillight is out," Murphy replied, though the camera footage clearly showed both taillights functioning properly when Robert had pulled over. "Officer, I just had my car inspected last week," Robert responded politely. "I don't believe there's anything wrong with my taillights." This was the moment. Attorney Johnson explained to the jury when a routine traffic stop began its transformation into a death sentence. Instead of simply checking the taillight to verify the claimed violation, Officer Murphy became confrontational. "Are you arguing with me?" Murphy's voice carried an edge of aggression that would escalate rapidly. Officer Jennifer Wilson's voice could be heard in the background as she approached the passenger side of the vehicle. "We've got a resistant subject here, Sandra." Robert Washington never raised his voice, never moved his hands from the steering wheel, never displayed any behavior that could reasonably be interpreted as threatening. Yet both officers were already treating him as a dangerous criminal rather than a respectful citizen. The footage continued, showing the systematic escalation that would lead to Robert Washington's death, and proving that everything the officers had claimed in their reports was a deliberate lie. Defense attorney Michael Richardson rose slowly from his table, knowing that the body camera footage had demolished any hope of defending his client successfully. The parallels between Robert Washington's death and Judge Washington's assault were so obvious that even the most sympathetic jury would struggle to ignore them. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Richardson began, his voice lacking its usual confidence, "what you have just seen is a tragic incident that occurred during a lawful traffic stop. My clients, Officers Murphy and Wilson, were following established police procedures when they encountered what they reasonably believed to be a dangerous situation." Several jurors exchanged skeptical glances. The body camera footage had clearly shown Robert Washington complying with every police command, while the officers escalated the situation unnecessarily. Richardson continued, "Police officers must make split-second decisions in potentially life-threatening situations. They cannot afford to hesitate when they believe their lives are in danger." Judge Washington leaned forward slightly, his bandaged forehead catching the courtroom lights. "Counselor, are you suggesting that a man sitting in his car with his hands on the steering wheel posed a life-threatening danger to two armed police officers?" Richardson hesitated. The question was perfectly legal and within the judge's authority, but it cut directly to the heart of his defense strategy's weakness. "Your Honor, the officers perceived a threat based on the suspect's, the deceased's, refusal to immediately comply with lawful orders." "Counselor," Judge Washington interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of personal experience, "I want you to be very careful about how you characterize Mr. Robert Washington's behavior. The jury has seen the footage. They can determine for themselves whether asking for clarification constitutes refusal to comply." Attorney Johnson objected. "Your Honor, I believe the defense is mischaracterizing the evidence that was just presented." "Sustained," Judge Washington ruled immediately. "Mr. Richardson, please stick to the facts as shown in the evidence, not your interpretation of what the officers might have been thinking." Richardson's strategy was falling apart in real time. He had planned to argue that Robert Washington's behavior justified the officers' response, but the body camera footage made that argument impossible to sustain credibly. Meanwhile, outside the courthouse, the demonstrations that had begun after Judge Washington's assault were growing larger by the hour. Protesters carried signs reading, "Justice for Robert," and "Judge Washington stands for justice." News crews from every major network had arrived to cover what was being called the most significant police accountability trial in American history. Back in the courtroom, Richardson attempted to pivot to his backup strategy. "Ladies and gentlemen, police work is inherently dangerous. Officers Murphy and Wilson had to make decisions based on their training and experience in a rapidly evolving situation." Judge Washington interrupted again. "Mr. Richardson, I'm going to ask you to be more specific. What aspect of their training taught them to draw weapons on a man sitting peacefully in his car?" The question hung in the air like a sword over Richardson's defense. He knew that police training actually emphasized de-escalation and proportional response, the exact opposite of what his clients had done. "Your Honor, I would argue that the officer's perception of threat was reasonable given the circumstances." "Which circumstances specifically?" Judge Washington pressed. "A 68-year-old man sitting in his car, a man who identified himself as a retired police officer, a man who was attempting to show identification when ordered to exit his vehicle. Richardson realized he was being systematically dismantled by a judge who understood police procedure better than most attorneys, because he had just experienced the same type of unjustified police violence himself. Attorney Johnson rose for her cross-examination of the first defense witness, Officer Murphy herself. She had been preparing for this moment for 3 years. But the morning's events had given her questions a devastating new context. "Officer Murphy," Johnson began, "how many years of police training did you receive before becoming a sworn officer?" 6 months at the academy, plus field training," Murphy replied, her voice barely audible. "And during that training, were you taught that citizens have the right to ask questions during traffic stops?" Murphy shifted uncomfortably. "Yes, but they also have to comply with lawful orders. Officer Murphy, what lawful order did Robert Washington refuse to comply with?" The question was simple, but Murphy couldn't answer it honestly without admitting that Robert Washington had done nothing wrong. "He was argumentative and uncooperative," Murphy said weakly. "Officer Murphy, you've seen the body camera footage. Can you point to any moment where Robert Washington raised his voice, used profanity, or displayed aggressive behavior?" Murphy stared at her hands. "No, but his attitude." "His attitude?" Johnson interrupted. "Officer Murphy, is it illegal to have an attitude?" "No, but when someone acts suspicious..." What suspicious behavior did Robert Washington display? Sitting in his car? Keeping his hands visible? Attempting to show identification when requested? Richardson objected desperately. "Your Honor, counsel is badgering the witness." "Overruled," Judge Washington said firmly. "The witness will answer the question." Murphy looked toward her attorney for help. But Richardson had no assistance to offer. The truth was too obvious to deny. "He reached toward his pocket," Murphy finally said. "After announcing that he was going to show you his retired police identification," Johnson replied, "Officer Murphy, if someone tells you exactly what they're going to do before they do it, how is that suspicious behavior?" The silence that followed was deafening. Murphy had no answer that wouldn't condemn her further. Attorney David Johnson approached the evidence table, where a collection of items told the story of Robert Washington's final moments. Each piece of evidence contradicted the officers' official reports and exposed the systematic lies that had initially protected them from accountability. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Johnson announced, "I want to show you the items that were found in Robert Washington's car after he was killed. These items will prove beyond any doubt that Officers Murphy and Wilson were never in danger." She held up a clear evidence bag containing a worn leather wallet. "This is what Robert Washington was reaching for when Officer Murphy claimed he was grabbing a weapon. Inside this wallet, you will find his retired police identification, his driver's license, and photographs of his grandchildren." Johnson opened the wallet carefully, displaying its contents to the jury. "There is no weapon. There never was a weapon. Robert Washington was reaching for his police ID to de-escalate the situation, exactly what any reasonable person would do when confronted by aggressive officers." She moved to the next piece of evidence. "This is the medical examiner's report on Robert Washington's death. The autopsy shows that all 3 bullets struck him in the back, proving that he was not lunging toward the officers as they claimed. He was standing still with his hands raised when Officer Wilson executed him." Judge Washington watched the proceedings with intense focus, his bandaged forehead serving as a constant reminder of how quickly police encounters could turn violent. The parallels between his father's death and his own assault were becoming more obvious with each piece of evidence. Johnson continued her presentation. "The officers claimed in their initial reports that Robert Washington was combative and uncooperative. But we have the complete audio from both body cameras, and not once, not even when he was being shot, did Robert Washington raise his voice or use profane language." She played another segment of audio, where Robert Washington's final words could be heard clearly. "Please don't shoot me, I'm a retired police officer. I have grandchildren." The courtroom was silent, except for the sound of several jurors weeping quietly. Defense attorney Richardson knew his case was hopeless, but he was obligated to mount some defense for his clients. He rose for his cross-examination of the medical examiner, Dr. Patricia Hernandez. "Dr. Hernandez," Richardson began, Is it possible that the deceased could have been moving toward the officers at the moment he was shot, even though the bullet struck him in the back? Dr. Hernandez, a veteran forensic pathologist with 30 years of experience, looked at Richardson with barely concealed disgust. "Counselor, the bullet trajectory analysis shows that Robert Washington was standing stationary with his hands raised above his head when he was shot. The angle of entry and the spacing of the wounds make any other scenario physically impossible." Richardson pressed on desperately. "But could he have been turning around at the moment of impact?" "No," Dr. Hernandez replied firmly. "The evidence is conclusive. Robert Washington was facing away from the officers with his hands in the air when Officer Wilson fired 3 shots into his back. This was an execution, not self-defense." The word execution echoed through the courtroom like a gavel striking wood. Even Judge Washington, who had maintained perfect judicial composure throughout the trial, closed his eyes briefly as the reality of his father's murder was confirmed by scientific evidence. Johnson called her next witness, Detective Rebecca Thompson from Internal Affairs, who had investigated the initial incident. Thompson took the stand with obvious reluctance. Her testimony would expose the cover-up that had initially protected Murphy and Wilson. "Detective Thompson," Johnson began, "when you first investigated this shooting, what did Officers Murphy and Wilson tell you happened?" Thompson consulted her notes, though she clearly remembered the lies she had been told. "They claimed that Robert Washington had refused to comply with orders, became physically aggressive, and lunged at Officer Murphy with what appeared to be a weapon. And based on their statements, what was your initial finding?" Thompson's voice was barely audible. "I ruled the shooting justified based on the officers' reports." "Detective Thompson, have you since reviewed the body camera footage?" "Yes." "And does that footage support the officers' version of events?" Thompson stared at her hands. "No, the footage proves that everything they told me was a lie." Johnson pressed the advantage. "Detective, would you say that Officers Murphy and Wilson deliberately provided false information to obstruct your investigation?" "Yes. They committed perjury and obstruction of justice." Judge Washington leaned forward. "Detective Thompson, why wasn't this footage reviewed during your initial investigation?" The question cut to the heart of police corruption. Thompson shifted uncomfortably before answering. "Your Honor, the officers claimed their body cameras malfunctioned during the incident. It wasn't until the family's attorney filed a federal lawsuit that we discovered the footage had been archived in a separate system. The revelation sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Not only had the officers lied about the shooting, but they had also concealed evidence that would have immediately exposed their lies." Judge Washington's voice carried a cold fury that chilled everyone present. "Detective Thompson, are you telling this court that police officers can simply claim their cameras malfunctioned and avoid accountability for their actions? Your Honor, we've since implemented new protocols to prevent—" "Detective Thompson," Judge Washington interrupted, "how many other cases might have been affected by similar malfunctions?" The question hung in the air like an indictment of the entire system. The courtroom atmosphere grew heavier as Detective Thompson's testimony revealed the systematic corruption that had protected Officers Murphy and Wilson for 3 years. Judge Washington's questions had exposed a pattern of evidence suppression that suggested Robert Washington's case was not an isolated incident. Attorney Johnson seized the moment to expose the full scope of the cover-up. "Detective Thompson, how many other cases in your department involved officers claiming body camera malfunctions during controversial incidents?" Thompson looked toward her supervisor in the gallery, seeking guidance that would not come. I would need to review the files to give you an exact number." "Detective, I'll ask you again," Johnson pressed. "How many cases?" "At least 12 in the past 5 years," Thompson admitted quietly. The number sent a collective gasp through the courtroom. 12 cases where officers had allegedly experienced convenient equipment failures during incidents that resulted in civilian deaths or serious injuries. The pattern was too obvious to ignore. Judge Washington's voice cut through the stunned silence. "Detective Thompson, in how many of those 12 cases were the officers ultimately held accountable for their actions?" Thompson's answer was barely audible. "None, Your Honor. The admission was devastating. For 5 years, the Chicago Police Department had allowed officers to escape accountability by simply claiming their recording equipment had malfunctioned. Robert Washington's death was part of a systematic pattern of cover-ups and corruption. Detective Thompson, Attorney Johnson continued, who made the decision to rule Robert Washington's shooting justified without reviewing the body camera footage? Captain Maria Rodriguez, Thompson replied, naming the officer who would later become embroiled in her own scandal when internal emails revealed her instructing subordinates to give our officers the benefit of the doubt in borderline cases. Judge Washington leaned forward, his voice carrying a mix of judicial authority and personal anguish. Detective Thompson, are you telling this court that my father's death was covered up by officers who knew the truth could be found in body camera footage they chose not to review? Yes, Your Honor, Thompson replied, tears beginning to stream down her face. We failed your father. We failed your family. And we failed every citizen who trusted us to seek the truth. The emotional weight of the testimony was palpable throughout the courtroom. Several jurors were visibly crying, while others stared at the defendants with expressions of disgust and disbelief. Attorney Johnson called her final witness, FBI agent Marcus Williams, who had led the federal investigation that ultimately exposed the body camera footage. Agent Williams had no relation to the Washington family, despite sharing a similar surname, a coincidence that had initially made him hesitant to take the case. Agent Williams, Johnson began, when you first reviewed the body camera footage from Robert Washington's death, what was your immediate reaction? Agent Williams, a 20-year veteran of federal law enforcement, spoke with measured authority. Ms. Johnson, in 20 years of investigating police misconduct cases, I have rarely seen such a clear-cut example of unjustified, deadly force followed by systematic evidence suppression. He gestured toward the defendants. Officers Murphy and Wilson didn't just kill an innocent man. They lied about it repeatedly, filed false reports, and participated in a conspiracy to hide evidence that would have immediately exposed their crimes. Defense attorney Richardson made one last desperate attempt to salvage his case. Agent Williams, isn't it possible that the officers genuinely believed they were in danger, even if their perception was ultimately incorrect? Agent Williams looked at Richardson with barely concealed contempt. Counselor, the body camera footage shows Robert Washington sitting motionless in his vehicle with his hands visible on the steering wheel. He identified himself as a retired police officer. He verbally announced every movement before making it. In what universe does that constitute a threat that justifies execution? The agent's voice grew stronger as he continued. Furthermore, the ballistics evidence proves that Robert Washington was shot in the back while standing with his hands raised. There is no reasonable explanation for that action other than murder. Judge Washington watched his father's killers squirm in their seats as the full weight of evidence crushed any hope of acquittal. The parallels between his father's death and his own assault that morning were undeniable. Both incidents involved officers who made assumptions based on racial bias and escalated peaceful encounters into violence. Agent Williams, Attorney Johnson asked, in your expert opinion, could Robert Washington's death have been prevented? Absolutely, Williams replied without hesitation. Every aspect of police training emphasizes de-escalation and proportional response. These officers chose violence as their first option rather than their last resort. Robert Washington died because officers Murphy and Wilson saw a black man and decided he was a threat, despite all evidence to the contrary. The agent paused, looking directly at the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, this case represents everything wrong with policing in America. When officers can kill innocent citizens and hide behind false reports and equipment malfunctions, no one is safe. No one. As Agent Williams left the stand, it was clear that the prosecution had presented an overwhelming case. The defense had no credible response to the mountain of evidence proving that Robert Washington's death was an unjustified execution covered up by systematic corruption. Judge Washington looked at the defendants, seeing not just his father's killers, but representatives of a broken system that prioritized protecting bad cops over serving justice. The time for accountability had finally arrived. After 3 hours of deliberation, The jury returned to the courtroom. The foreman, a retired teacher named Robert Martinez, held the verdict in his hands with the weight of history. 12 million Americans were still watching the live broadcast, and the entire nation waited to see whether justice would finally be served. Judge Michael Washington took his seat at the bench, the bandage on his forehead now a symbol of police accountability that had spread across social media worldwide. The hashtag #JudgeWashingtonJustice was trending in 17 countries. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Washington asked formally. "We have, Your Honor," Martinez replied, his voice steady and clear. "In the case of the People versus Officer Sandra Murphy, on the charge of second-degree murder, how do you find?" Martinez looked directly at Officer Murphy before answering. "We find the defendant guilty." The courtroom erupted in a mixture of gasps, applause, and tears. Murphy's face went pale as the reality of a murder conviction sank in. Her police career was over, and she faced decades in prison. In the case of the People versus Officer Jennifer Wilson, on the charge of second-degree murder, how do you find? "We find the defendant guilty." Wilson collapsed into her chair, her attorney's hand on her shoulder, providing little comfort. Both officers had been convicted of murdering Robert Washington, one of the first times in American history that police officers had been held accountable for killing a black man during what they claimed was a justified shooting. But Judge Washington wasn't finished. He had one more case to address: the assault that had occurred in his own courthouse just hours earlier. "Bailiff Brown, please bring in the defendants Rodriguez and Thompson." The two officers who had assaulted Judge Washington were escorted into the courtroom in handcuffs and orange jumpsuits. Their booking photos had already been shared millions of times on social media, making them the faces of police brutality in America. "Officers Rodriguez and Thompson," Judge Washington began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had faced their violence and survived, "you have been charged with assault and battery against a federal judge, violation of civil rights under color of law, and obstruction of justice. How do you plead?" Rodriguez's attorney, clearly overwhelmed by the circumstances, whispered urgently in his client's ear. The entire assault had been broadcast live to millions of people. There was no possible defense. "Your Honor," Rodriguez's attorney said finally, "my client pleads guilty to all charges." Thompson followed immediately. "Your Honor, my client also pleads guilty to all charges." The guilty pleas eliminated the need for another trial. But Judge Washington had something more important than legal proceedings in mind. He was about to deliver a statement that would be studied in law schools and quoted by civil rights leaders for generations. "Officers Rodriguez and Thompson," he began, standing from his judicial bench to address them directly, "your assault on me this morning was witnessed by 12 million Americans. But your crime represents more than just an attack on one individual. It represents an attack on the very concept of justice itself." He paused, letting his words resonate through the packed courtroom and across the television screens of millions of viewers. "When you grabbed me in that hallway, you did so because you saw a black man and assumed he didn't belong in a place of justice. When you slammed me against that door, you did so because you believed your authority superseded my rights. When you left me bleeding on the marble floor of this courthouse, you did so because you never considered that the person you were brutalizing might be the very judge you were supposed to protect." Rodriguez stared at the floor, unable to meet Judge Washington's eyes. Thompson appeared to be fighting back tears as the magnitude of her actions became clear. "But here is what you failed to understand," Judge Washington continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Justice does not depend on who you think deserves it. Justice is not reserved for people who look like you, act like you, or share your assumptions about who belongs where. Justice is universal, or it is meaningless." He gestured toward the camera that was broadcasting his words to the nation. What America witnessed today was both the problem and the solution. The problem is officers who see violence as their first option rather than their last resort. The solution is a justice system that holds everyone accountable, regardless of their uniform or their position. Judge Washington returned to his seat and addressed both sets of defendants, the officers who had killed his father and the officers who had assaulted him. "Officers Murphy and Wilson, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years to life in federal prison without the possibility of parole. Your actions took the life of a good man, a devoted father, and a public servant who dedicated his career to protecting others. He turned to Rodriguez and Thompson. Officers Rodriguez and Thompson, you are hereby sentenced to 10 years in federal prison and lifetime prohibition from law enforcement employment. Your actions were witnessed by the entire nation and serve as a perfect example of how not to serve and protect. But Judge Washington had one final statement to make, one that would transform this moment from a legal proceeding into a national call for justice. To the police officers watching this broadcast, he said, looking directly into the camera, understand that what happened here today is not an attack on law enforcement. It is a defense of what law enforcement should be. Good officers have nothing to fear from accountability. Only bad officers need to hide behind the badge instead of honoring it. The gavel came down with finality, but the impact of Judge Washington's justice would resonate far beyond the courthouse walls. Within hours of the verdicts, the impact of Judge Washington's trial was being felt across every level of American law enforcement and government. The live broadcast had created an unprecedented moment of accountability that could not be ignored, covered up, or explained away. In Washington, D.C., emergency sessions were being called in Congress. Senator Elizabeth Warren was drafting what would become known as the Robert Washington Police Accountability Act. Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was demanding federal oversight of police departments nationwide. Even conservative Republicans were acknowledging that something fundamental needed to change. President Biden addressed the nation from the Oval Office that evening. What we witnessed in Judge Michael Washington's courtroom today represents both the worst and the best of American justice. We saw the worst when police officers committed brutal acts of violence, but we also saw the best when our justice system held those officers accountable, regardless of their badges or their assumptions about who deserves protection under the law. The Chicago Police Department was in complete crisis. Superintendent Robert Johnson had called an emergency meeting of all precinct commanders, knowing that the department's reputation had been destroyed by the actions of 4 officers who thought they were above the law. Effective immediately, Johnson announced to his commanders, every officer in this department will undergo mandatory retraining in de-escalation, cultural sensitivity, and constitutional law. Any officer who cannot pass these requirements will be dismissed without pension benefits. The police union, which had initially planned to defend Rodriguez and Thompson, quickly reversed course when they realized that public opinion had turned decisively against them. Union President Michael Rodriguez issued a statement. The actions of these officers do not represent the values of the Chicago Police Department or law enforcement in general. We support Judge Washington and his commitment to justice for all. But the changes weren't limited to Chicago. Police departments across America were implementing immediate reforms to avoid being associated with the type of brutality that had been exposed on live television. In New York, Police Commissioner Sarah Martinez announced mandatory body cameras for all officers and civilian oversight of all use of force incidents. In Los Angeles, Chief Roberto Gonzalez implemented a new policy requiring officers to intervene when they witnessed colleagues using excessive force. The FBI announced a sweeping investigation into police departments nationwide, focusing specifically on cases where body camera footage had mysteriously malfunctioned during controversial incidents. Director Christopher Wray stated, "The American people deserve to know how many other cases like Robert Washington's death have been covered up by deliberate evidence suppression." Back in Chicago, Judge Washington returned to his chambers after the most significant day of his legal career. The bandage on his forehead had been replaced with a smaller one, but the symbolism remained powerful. He had become the face of judicial courage and police accountability in America. His assistant, Maria Gonzalez, brought him a stack of messages that had poured in throughout the day. "Your Honor, you've received calls from the Supreme Court, the Department of Justice, and over 50 civil rights organizations. The President wants to meet with you personally." Judge Washington sat down heavily in his chair, the emotional and physical toll of the day finally catching up with him. "Maria, all I wanted was justice for my father. I never intended to become a symbol of anything. Your Honor, Maria replied gently, sometimes history chooses us rather than the other way around. What you did today, presiding over that trial despite your own assault, refusing to let violence intimidate justice, that's what leadership looks like. Outside the courthouse, the demonstrations that had begun after Judge Washington's assault had transformed into celebrations of justice. Thousands of people gathered with candles, holding signs that read, "Thank you, Judge Washington," and justice finally served. Civil rights leader Reverend Shaz. Al Sharpton addressed the crowd. What we witnessed today proves that justice is possible when we have judges who are committed to the law rather than to protecting the powerful. Judge Michael Washington has shown us what courage looks like. The family of Robert Washington held their own press conference outside the courthouse. Robert's widow, Eleanor Washington, spoke through tears. My husband served this community for 25 years as a police officer. He believed in justice, and he would be proud to see that justice finally prevailed in this courtroom today. But perhaps the most significant change was happening within police departments themselves. Young officers who had joined law enforcement to serve and protect were speaking out against the culture of violence and cover-ups that had protected officers like Murphy, Wilson, Rodriguez, and Thompson. Officer Janet Martinez, a rookie in Chicago PD, posted a video on social media that went viral. I became a police officer to help people, not to hurt them. What happened to Judge Washington and his father represents everything wrong with policing. We need to do better, and that starts with officers like me refusing to stay silent when we see abuse. The video was shared by thousands of police officers across the country, creating a movement within law enforcement itself. Major police academies began updating their training curricula to include extensive education about implicit bias, constitutional rights, and de-escalation techniques. The standard warrior mentality training that had produced officers like Rodriguez and Thompson was being replaced with guardian mentality training that emphasized protection and service. Corporate America was also responding to the moment. Major companies began requiring police accountability clauses in any contracts with law enforcement agencies. Sports teams, entertainment companies, and technology firms announced they would only work with police departments that had implemented comprehensive reform programs. The transformation that Judge Washington had triggered was becoming unstoppable, spreading through every institution in American society. 6 months after the trial that changed America, Judge Michael Washington stood in the same courthouse where he had been assaulted by officers Rodriguez and Thompson. But now, instead of a bandage on his forehead, he wore a small scar that had become a symbol of resilience and justice worldwide. The courthouse had been renamed the Robert Washington Federal Courthouse in honor of his father, and a bronze plaque in the marble hallway marked the exact spot where he had been attacked and where he had chosen to fight back with law rather than violence. The Robert Washington Police Accountability Act had passed Congress with bipartisan support, creating federal oversight of police departments, mandatory federal prosecution of police brutality cases, and a national database of officers dismissed for misconduct. President Biden had signed the legislation in a ceremony attended by Judge Washington and dozens of families who had lost loved ones to police violence. Officers Murphy and Wilson were serving their life sentences in federal prison, where they had become symbols of what happened to police officers who believed they were above the law. Officers Rodriguez and Thompson were also imprisoned, their case studied in police academies as an example of how quickly a career could be destroyed by a single act of brutality. But the most significant changes were happening in communities across America, where the relationship between police and citizens was being rebuilt on foundations of accountability and mutual respect. In Chicago, crime rates had actually decreased after the police reforms were implemented. Community policing programs brought officers and residents together for problem-solving rather than confrontation. Young people who had once feared police were now participating in citizen review boards and police training programs. Detective Rebecca Thompson, who had initially covered up Robert Washington's murder, had been demoted and reassigned to a desk job. But she had also become an advocate for police reform, traveling to departments across the country to explain how the culture of protecting bad officers ultimately destroyed good officers' ability to serve effectively. I spent 15 years enabling police brutality by looking the other way, Thompson told a conference of police chiefs in Atlanta. Judge Washington taught me that accountability makes us stronger, not weaker. When we hold bad officers responsible, we protect the integrity of good officers. The National Court Network had won a Pulitzer Prize for their live coverage of Judge Washington's trial, but more importantly, they had established a new standard for transparency in judicial proceedings. Courts across America were now broadcasting high-profile cases live, ensuring that justice could not be hidden from public view. Rebecca Hayes, the anchor who had guided the nation through that historic day, interviewed Judge Washington on the 6-month anniversary of the trial. "Judge Washington," Hayes asked, "when you walked into that courthouse 6 months ago, did you imagine that your personal tragedy would become a catalyst for national change?" Judge Washington, now wearing his full judicial robes with quiet dignity, considered the question carefully. "Rebecca, I learned that day that justice isn't something that happens to us. It's something we make happen. My father's death could have been meaningless if I had allowed his killers to escape accountability. My own assault could have been just another example of police brutality if I had chosen to step aside instead of fighting back." He paused, looking directly into the camera that had captured his moment of truth 6 months earlier. But when we choose justice over comfort, accountability over protection, truth over convenience, that's when we honor not just the victims of brutality, but the promise of what America can become. The interview was being watched by millions of Americans, including police officers who had changed their approach to law enforcement after witnessing Judge Washington's courage. Officer Janet Martinez, who had spoken out against police brutality after the trial, was now training new recruits in constitutional policing. "Judge Washington showed us that being a police officer means protecting everyone, including people who look different from us, think different from us, or challenge us," she told her trainees. "The badge is a symbol of service, not superiority." In schools across America, Judge Washington's story was being taught as an example of how one person's courage could transform an entire system. Students were learning about the Constitution, civil rights, and the importance of speaking truth to power. The Robert Washington Foundation, established by Judge Washington to support families affected by police violence, had already helped hundreds of families navigate the legal system and find justice for their loved ones. But more importantly, it was working with police departments to implement the kind of reforms that could prevent future tragedies. FBI Director Christopher Wray had delivered on his promise to investigate police departments nationwide. The investigation had revealed that the pattern of body camera malfunctions during controversial incidents was endemic across American law enforcement. Over 200 cases were reopened, leading to dozens of convictions and hundreds of police dismissals. The Washington investigation, as it came to be known, had exposed a culture of cover-ups that extended far beyond Chicago. Police chiefs across the country were being forced to confront decades of systematic corruption and evidence suppression. The changes were not without resistance. Some police unions continued to defend the old system, arguing that accountability measures would make officers hesitant to act in dangerous situations. But public opinion had shifted decisively after Judge Washington's trial, and politicians who opposed police reform found themselves voted out of office. Most importantly, the culture of American policing was changing from within. Young officers were refusing to participate in cover-ups. Veteran officers were speaking out against colleagues who used excessive force. Police academies were producing graduates who saw themselves as guardians rather than warriors. Judge Washington had accomplished something unprecedented in American history. He had transformed personal tragedy into systemic change, proving that justice was possible when courage met opportunity. 1 year after the trial that transformed America, Judge Michael Washington delivered the keynote address at the National Conference on Police Accountability in Washington, D.C. The conference had been established in his honor, bringing together law enforcement leaders, civil rights advocates, and families affected by police violence. Standing at the podium, the small scar on his forehead barely visible under the conference lights, Judge Washington looked out at an audience that included police chiefs who had implemented revolutionary reforms and officers who had found the courage to hold their colleagues accountable. 1 year ago, he began, I walked into a courthouse seeking justice for my father's murder. I never imagined that I would become a victim of the same type of violence that had killed him. But I also never imagined that 12 million Americans would witness that violence and demand change. He paused, his voice carrying the weight of transformation that had swept across the nation. Today, we gather not to celebrate what happened to me or my father, but to celebrate what America chose to do with that pain. We chose accountability over comfort. We chose justice over convenience. We chose truth over protection. In the audience, Eleanor Washington, Robert's widow and Michael's mother, wiped away tears as she listened to her son transform their family's tragedy into a call for continued progress. The statistics Judge Washington shared were remarkable. Police killings of unarmed civilians had decreased by 67% in the year following his trial. Body camera compliance had reached 98% nationwide after the federal mandate. Civilian complaint investigations were now conducted by independent agencies in all 50 states. But statistics tell only part of the story, Judge Washington continued. The real change is happening in the hearts and minds of police officers who have chosen to honor their oath to serve and protect rather than hide behind their badges. He gestured toward Officer Janet Martinez, who was now serving as Deputy Chief of Community Relations in Chicago. Officer Martinez represents the new generation of law enforcement. Officers who understand that accountability makes them stronger, not weaker. Martinez stood and addressed the audience. Judge Washington taught us that courage isn't just about facing danger in the streets. Sometimes the greatest courage is facing corruption in our own departments and saying, "This ends now." The applause was thunderous, but Judge Washington wasn't finished. He had one more message for the nation that had supported his fight for justice. "The work is not complete," he announced. "Every day, families across America still face the possibility that a routine encounter with police could turn deadly. Every day, officers still must choose between doing what's right and protecting their colleagues. Every day, we must choose whether to be comfortable with injustice or courageous enough to demand better." He looked directly into the cameras that were broadcasting his speech nationwide. "My father, Robert Washington, served his community for 25 years because he believed in justice. When he was killed, that belief was tested. When I was assaulted in my own courthouse, that belief was tested again. But justice survived because you, the American people, refused to let it die." The speech concluded with a call to action that would define his legacy. Justice is not a destination we reach and then rest. Justice is a choice we make every day, in every interaction, in every decision about whether to speak up or stay silent. My father's death has meaning because you gave it meaning. My assault has purpose because you gave it purpose. America is better because you chose to make it better. As the conference ended and attendees returned to their communities, the transformation that began with Judge Washington's courage continued to spread. Police departments that had once been plagued by corruption were now models of accountability. Families who had lost loved ones to police violence were finding justice in courts across the country. The Robert Washington Federal Courthouse had become a pilgrimage site for those seeking justice. The bronze plaque marking where Judge Washington had been assaulted bore a simple inscription, "Here justice chose courage over comfort." Thank you to everyone who typed accountability and shared your locations from around the globe. From Chicago to London, from Atlanta to Sydney, you've proven that the fight for judicial dignity transcends all borders. Seeing this global community united for equal justice and police accountability proves that courage in the face of injustice is a universal human value. If this story moved you, please subscribe for more incredible tales of justice triumphing over systemic oppression. Until next time, remember that true authority comes from serving justice, not avoiding it. The legacy of Judge Michael Washington would continue to inspire generations of Americans to choose justice over convenience, courage over comfort, and accountability over protection. His father's death had meaning. His assault had purpose. And America was better because he had chosen to fight back with law rather than violence. Justice had prevailed, and its echo would resonate through the halls of justice for generations to come.